name's Amanda Geller. I'm at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, and we're in the food coma time slot, but we've got a great set of presentations here. It's really an honor to be here and to be specifically at the Schomburg talking about communities and families. It's a topic that is very personal for a lot of people when you think about the fact that 2.7 million children in the United States have parents that are incarcerated, and the number of children affected grows exponentially when you think of broader kinship networks and when you think of family members negotiating reentry challenges. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go a little bit outside of the program order. We're going to lay out some of the challenges, and then we're going to present some solutions and some programs that have been shown to be effective for strengthening families and communities. So we'll start with Stephanie Campos, who's presenting an ethnographic study of women in a prison in Lima, Peru. And then Professor Dorothy Smith-Ruiz will talk about the situation of grandparents who take care of children when their mothers are incarcerated. Each of these presentations raises questions of how incarcerated individuals and their families can best be supported. And then we'll have Kathy Boudin and then Diana Hernández talking about support systems that institute. Turn it over to Stephanie.
All right, so hi, I'm going to talk about the work that I've done in Peru. Specifically, I want to talk about how the neglect of national healthcare systems may drive marginalized, low-income women of color to drug trafficking. So in these instances, I argue, participation in criminalized work is a survival strategy. For example, some mothers with limited financial means may work as low-level transporters or retailers of cocaine as a way to make up for their inability to obtain health care. So this paper is going to explore how the lack of access to adequate health care becomes a pathway to incarceration. Thank you.
Should be better.
Okay. Thank you.
Talk at it.
So this presentation is based on my dissertation fieldwork in the Santa Monica Women's Prison in Lima, Peru. Methods included ethnographic observation and life history narratives, with about 25 women serving sentences for trafficking cocaine. The prison was built in 1952 as a reformatory to hold 300 women, but at the time of my fieldwork in 2008-2009, it held more than 3 times its capacity. In August 2010, there were about 2,700 women incarcerated in Peruvian prisons. Now, this number had grown to over 3,800 by December 2012. So thus, the number of incarcerated women in Peru continues to grow. So we also see that even though women make up a smaller percentage of the total prison population in Peru, only about 6%, right? And the rest are men. More women than men in Peru are serving sentences for drug trafficking, right? Men, about 29% of imprisoned men